Hi, thanks for joining me. For those of you familiar with my channel, you may notice there's a new format here. That's because I just got a new computer and I'm using some different software. We'll see how this works out. For those of you new to the channel, my name is Mindy Mandell. Each week I go through one of Plato's dialogues, and my goal with this whole series of videos is to show the continuity of thought that runs through all of Plato's work. So if that sounds like something you would be interested in, please subscribe. I put out a new video each week. And today I'm going to be talking about the Statesman, and I'm going to be focusing on a myth in this dialogue about the Age of Cronus. Now, the Statesman follows the Sophist. It actually takes place right after it. It's like where the Sophist ends, that's where the Statesman begins. In the Sophist, we met four different people. There's Socrates there, also a man named Theodorus. He brought along a student of his named Theaetetus, and also they brought along a friend from the city-state of Alea, who was called the Stranger. And the Stranger was the main interlocutor in the dialogue Sophist. Now, here is actually a quote from the Sophist, where Socrates had introduced a dilemma that carried all the way through the Sophist and is going to continue through the Statesman as well. So he mentioned three different people: the Sophist, the Statesman, and the philosopher. And Theodorus asked what exactly is it about them that Socrates wanted to ask about. He said it's this. He wanted to know if the people of Alea consider all of these to be the same, or are there two, or are there, as there are three names, did they divide them into three classes and ascribe to each a class corresponding to a single name? So in other words, are the Sophist, Statesman, and Philosopher really three different people, or is there some overlap? Maybe the Sophist is really the same as the Statesman, or the Sophist and the Philosopher are the same, or maybe the Philosopher and the Statesman are the same. Or maybe just as there are three names, there really are three different people. So that was the question that was lingering from the dialogue Sophist. And of course, that dialogue focused on the Sophist. Today, we're going to be continuing with that with the Statesman. Socrates tells Theodorus, "I'm really very much indebted to you for my introduction to Theaetetus and to our guest from Alea." Theodorus says, "That's good, but you're likely to be 3 times as much in my debt, Socrates, when they have done their task and defined the Statesman and the Philosopher as well as the Sophist for you." Okay, so they're just continuing on. And by the way, all of the translations today are from J.B. Skimp. Oh yeah, I should point out, this one quote from the Sophist was from, the translator was Harold North Fowler, but all of the quotes from the Statesman are from J.B. Skimp. Okay, so then the question becomes, who is going to be the interlocutor with the Stranger? So the Stranger is the main speaker, not Socrates. And he's going to be talking to someone who has to answer the questions, right? So it was conventional for the youngest person in the group to be the one who answered the questions. Now here we already know that Theaetetus was one of the young men. There's actually another one, a fifth person who wasn't mentioned before, a young man whose name is also Socrates. And so the question is, which of these two is going to be the interlocutor? And so our Socrates has this suggestion. He says that these two young men might both be said to have some sort of kinship with me. Theaetetus, according to you, is like me in looks, and Socrates bears the same name. Sharing a name entails kinship in some sense, and of course we ought always to seize opportunities of discovering those who may be our kinsfolk by conversing with them. Well, yesterday I joined in discussion with Theaetetus, and that is the dialogue called Theaetetus. Today I've listened to him answering you. He's talking here, of course, to the Stranger, and that is the dialogue Sophist. But then Socrates goes on to say that he has not heard this young Socrates speak, either in discussion or in reply. He too must be tested. So he shall reply to me another time, but this afternoon let him answer you. So his suggestion is for young Socrates to be the interlocutor, and they ask the young man, and of course, he has to say yes, whether he wants to or not. And so he is the interlocutor here. So the two main speakers from this point on are the guest from Alea, who they call stranger, and young Socrates. Okay, so here's how they start off. Well then, after finding the Sophist, the task we now have to face together is to search out the Statesman, or so it seems to me. Tell me then, Socrates, whether he too must be classified as one of those who possess some kind of expert knowledge, or must we begin with some other kind of definition? No, he is to be defined as a kind of expert. Okay, so what we're going to see the stranger do is very much what he did in the Sophist, where he's going to take like two categories of something. He's going to split it into two and then say which one do we want to focus on. In this case, we're looking for the Statesman. Which one does the Statesman fit in? Oh, this one. Okay, we take this one and divide it into two and keep going in that way. Now, in the dialogue Sophist, we saw him doing this in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way. And that was part of the sophistry of it because he was playing the role of a sophist. But here he's taking a more serious look at it. Plato is taking a more serious look at how to divide properly. And so there's various pieces of advice scattered throughout the dialogue. For example, here's one. We must beware lest we break off one small fragment of a class and then contrast it with all the important sections left behind. We must only divide where there is a real cleavage between specific forms. The section must always possess a specific form. And here he's talking about the intelligible forms or ideas, the absolute realities. It is splendid if one really can divide off a class sought for immediately from all the rest. That is, if the structure of reality authorizes such immediate division. Okay, so here you see he's being more serious about the way that he divides. And he's going to go on this way, dividing, looking for the Statesman, until he comes to this very general definition of statesmanship, that it is the science of shepherding mankind. So we see a kind of a metaphor of the statesman to the shepherd. But it's also very general. You can imagine that there's going to be some problems with it. We're not quite done yet. He says, our argument defined it as the science of the collective rearing of men, as distinct from the rearing of horses or other animals. Quite so. But we have to notice one respect in which a king differs from all other herdsmen. What is it? Do we find any other herdsman challenged by a rival who practices another art and yet claims that he shares with the herdsman the duty of feeding the herd? What do you mean? You see how merchants, farmers, and all who prepare the grain for food, yes, and teachers of gymnastics and doctors as well, they would all dispute the title feeders of mankind with the herdsmen that we've called the statesmen. These others would all contend that they are in charge of the feeding of mankind, and of the feeding of leaders themselves, as well as the mass of the herd. Okay, so we see that they have to get more specific. He says, how then can the definition of the king reached in our discussion show up as correct and flawless in the light of these new facts? We are claiming that he alone is herdsman and shepherd of the human flock, but we're merely singling him out as such from a host of competitors. Okay, so now they have to get a more specific definition, so they have to ask, in what way does the statesman function as a shepherd of mankind, or what kind of shepherd, if you will, is the statesman? And that brings us to our myth of the Age of Cronus. Now, there are a few things I want to point out here. First of all, this is a tangent in the discussion. And we've already seen in some past dialogues that when Plato throws in a tangent, it's actually something very important. He's giving us something that is crucial for where he wants to take the argument going forward. And so we have to be asking ourselves all throughout this myth, how does this help us hone in our definition of the statesman? The second thing I want to point out here is that, yes, there were fundamentalists in Socrates' day and in Plato's day, but Socrates and Plato were not fundamentalists. Actually, Plato has a fun dialogue called the Euthyphro, which is one of the early dialogues, where he's kind of poking fun at fundamentalists. So if you want to be introduced to that dialogue or brush up on it, I do have a video on it. It's among the early dialogues. But what I want to point out here in this dialogue here is that whenever you see mythology in Plato's works, or also the later Platonists like Proclus makes many references to mythology, what you want to be doing is asking yourself what metaphysical truths or powers or functions are being mythologized here. Each of the gods is a personification of a divine function. And so looking at what they represent and how they interact with each other tells us something about what the author is trying to convey about metaphysics. Okay, so who's Cronus? Cronus is the intellect of the intelligible realm. Now, if you saw my videos on the Sophist, you may have seen something like this. We can divide, or metaphysics actually divides reality up into various realms. And as reality unfolds, I'm a little tongue-tied there, as reality unfolds, each subsequent realm is at a more diffused essence and at a lower power than its immediate cause. Yet each realm is proper and good at its own proper function and essence. And so there's a certain similitude that runs through all. But we can simplify it all by simply dividing reality in half and saying everything above is the realm of being. This is the intelligible realm, or what truly is. It is stable, abiding in itself, never changing. Our physical world is said to be in flux. It never simply is. It's always in a state of becoming. That's why we call it becoming. It's in a state of becoming, and it's always in flux, coming into and out of existence. Now, Kronos can be said to be the intellect who oversees, if you will, the realm of being, or the intelligible realm. Zeus, his son, is the intellectual god who oversees our physical world. Now, to be clear, Zeus is a god, not a physical being, but he oversees the physical world. In mythology, we often will see time or age or chronology being used to describe metaphysical functions. The intelligible realm is said to be beyond our physical world, and in that sense we can call it prior. But of course, when we use temporal terms or spatial terms, we have to understand that we're actually talking about realms of reality that are beyond time and space. And so the spatial language has to be adjusted. We have to expand our definition of these words. And so mythology can kind of play with this. Kronos is the father of Zeus, not because he truly exists at some prior time. They're both existing perpetually and eternally. We use the word eternal generally to talk about this realm, perpetual here, but both mean all of time and beyond time. But they don't actually exist, one before the other. So we're using those terms in a very different way, and mythology kind of plays on that. And so we want to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the events of the story. When we're talking about the age of Cronus and the age of Zeus, they're not actually time periods. We're talking about these realms. Okay, after that long introduction, let's get into it. Okay, so the stranger says, ever to be the same, steadfast and abiding, is the prerogative of the divinest of things only. That's the intelligible realm. The nature of the bodily does not entitle it to this rank. Now the heaven, or the universe as we have chosen to call it, has received many blessed gifts from him who brought it into being, but it has also been made to partake of bodily form. Hence, it is impossible that it should abide forever free from change. And yet, as far as may be, its movement is uniform, invariable, and in one place. Okay, a few things to point out here. First of all, the word heaven. Notice that it is not used in the way that Christians use it. It is not talking about where our souls go after we die. In Greek mythology, they talk about that, what we call heaven, they call the Elysian Fields, or the Isles of the Blessed. Here, notice that heaven is talking about the physical manifestation, or the world of becoming, or the universe. And so because it is all of the physical world, it means there's nowhere that it can move, and therefore it's always in one place. And because the realms have a certain similitude or similarity one to the other, whereas the intelligible world is same, steadfast, and abiding, the world of becoming, functioning at a lower power but with a certain similitude to its immediate cause, it is uniform, invariable, and in one place. Now the stranger goes on to say that there is an era in which God himself assists the universe on its way and guides it by imparting its rotation to it. There is also an era in which he releases his control. He does this when its circuits under his guidance have completed the due limit of the time thereto appointed. Thereafter, it begins to revolve in the contrary sense under its own impulse. For it is a living creature and has been endowed with reason by him who framed it in the beginning. And so there again you see the two different realms described as different time periods. And so the imagery we have here is that Cronus kind of like winds up the universe, and then at some point he lets it go until he winds it up again. Now you can guess that when he lets it go, everything is turning in the opposite direction. Time is moving in a different direction. It actually starts to move in the way that we consider time to be moving correctly. And you can imagine there's a lot of destruction because everything suddenly shifts. And so he describes it in this way. It must needs be that in the cosmic crisis there is widespread destruction of living creatures other than man, and that only a remnant of the human race survives. And he gives some description of that. And eventually, Cronus winds it up again. And then time is moving in a way that we would consider backwards. So first of all, every living creature, whatever the stage of life it had attained, ceased to grow any older. All mortal beings halted on their way to bent and hoary age, and each began to grow backward, as it were, toward youth and ever greater immaturity. So clearly, young Socrates, it was no part of man's natural endowment in that era to beget children by intercourse. Our legends tell us that once upon a time there was an earth-born race. Now it was this race which at that moment of crisis began to return to life out of the earth. And it is only to be expected that along with the reversal of the old men's course of life and their return to childhood, a new race of men should arise too, a new race formed from men dead and long laid in earth, but now formed in her womb anew, and thence returning to life once more. So that's the earthbound race. Now it sounds kind of like a zombie apocalypse movie, but actually I think what they're describing here is something we're supposed to see as positive, because they're coming out of nature, out of the natural realm, so coming from a higher realm, if you will. So these represent wiser people. Now there are many differences between those who lived in the age of Cronus and those who live in the age of Zeus. Here is one of the more significant differences. As for your inquiry concerning the age when all good things come without man's labor, the answer is that this also most certainly belongs to the former era, the age of Cronus, and not to the present one, the age of Zeus. Now, we can see throughout this parallels to our own experiences of these two realms. In the Republic, for example, Book 7, there's the allegory of the cave, where we imagine somebody coming as like a prisoner in the cave, and then they go through a journey of leaving the cave and eventually experiencing the upper world, adjusting to the sunlight, and eventually seeing the sun itself in its own place. And seeing that upper world would be the intelligible world, and so that is what in this myth is called the Age of Cronus, whereas the life in the cave would be comparable to the Age of Zeus. Now there's different energies functioning both in the cave and in the upper world, or in these two different ages, and we saw that in the Republic in the divided line. But here what we're looking at is looking at the energies of these two different ages. Now, under the intellectual energy of Zeus, so to speak, we have to use reason and logic to go step by step through our reasoning to figure things out. But when we're able to tap into those higher energies personified by Cronus, then we find that we have sort of like an instantaneous understanding. We have insight. We have intuition. We just instantly know things. It comes easy. Good things come without effort in the era of Cronus. Also, the Age of Cronus is called a paradise. He says that God was their shepherd and had charge of them, even as men now have charge of the other creatures inferior to them. For men are closer to the divine than they. So here we have the idea of a shepherd brought in. So we're starting to get some foreshadowing. You can kind of imagine where Plato's going to go with this, showing that the statesman functions like a shepherd the way Cronus functioned as a shepherd in this myth. And he says, this is the story, Socrates, of the life of men under the government of Cronus. Our present life, said to be under the government of Zeus, you're alive to experience for yourself. But which of these two makes for greater happiness, do you think? Can you give a verdict, and will you do so? No, young Socrates tells us, I cannot decide. And now here is a key passage to the myth. The crucial question is, did the nurslings of Cronus make a right use of their time? They had abundance of leisure and were at an advantage in being able to converse with the animals as well as with one another. Did they use all these advantages to promote philosophical inquiry? As they associated with one another and with the animals, did they seek to learn from each several tribe of creatures whether its special faculties enabled it to apprehend some distinctive truth not available to the rest, which it could bring as its contribution to swell the common treasure store of wisdom? Okay, now in the Platonic tradition, we don't just seek peak experiences for the excitement of it. I've met many people who just want to have a peak experience so that they have a story to tell their friends because they think it's cool, but they don't necessarily understand it, and so it doesn't have the significance in their lives that it could potentially have. In this tradition, the important thing is not to experience the objects of knowledge in the intelligible world, but to understand them and to understand their significance in our lives. So in the Republic, the idea of the philosopher king was somebody who did go up out of the cave, but then went back down and incorporated that knowledge and carried with him or her an image of a memory, if you will, of that experience of absolute goodness, justice, and beauty, and then acted in the world from that higher knowledge. That's what it means to be wise. So wisdom and knowledge are two different things. Wisdom comes when you can incorporate knowledge, understand it, and act from that. And so that gives us some idea of where he's going here with the idea of the statesman. So when you have that experience, is it enough to have it? How did you use that experience? Did you bring it back? Did you apply it? Okay, and then here's another idea that we can also apply to the allegory of the cave. The idea that after an experience, actually, if any of you have ever had one, or in the future, if you do have one, I recommend you write your ideas down. If you've ever had this experience, and I think you relate to what I'm about to say, those of you who have not yet had such an experience, when you do have one, or if you have one, you're going to have lots of insights, because even when you return to your ego self, go back down into the cave, you're going to carry with you some of that energy, kind of like an afterglow, and it's going to stay with you for a little while. And you're going to have lots of insights, and things are going to be really obvious to you. You'll think you'll never forget this. You will forget this because your energy is going to settle. And that's described here, but in terms of the myth, because here, instead of talking about a person having such an experience of that higher energy and then returning to the ego self, here it's a description of two different ages. When Cronus, he rewound, and now he's going to let it go. And now the universe in the age of Zeus is moving on its own government. That would be like comparable to the ego self returning, and we're functioning on our own government. And so he's describing it here. Attaining quiet after great upheaval, The universe returned to its ordered course and continued in it, having control and government of itself and of all within it, and remembering, so far as it was able, the instruction it had received from God, its Maker and its Father. At first it remembered his instructions more clearly, but as time went on, its recollection grew dim. The bodily element in its constitution was responsible for its failure. There's one more thing in this myth that I want to point out that has a parallel in the Republic. In the Republic, we were given certain laws that we initially accepted as hypotheses, but with the idea that as our understanding deepens and then as we gain understanding and understanding of our experiences, our conviction will grow stronger. Now, one of those laws was that God is the cause of good things, but not all things. And we saw as the dialogue went on that this is because reality unfolds in realms, and by the time reality reaches the physical realm, here its essence is more differentiated, its power is more diffused, although it is still functioning at its own proper power and it's still good in its own right. It is a weaker power, and so here false belief is able to work its way into the progressions of reality. False belief doesn't come from, there's not like an absolute reality of false belief. And so that idea is captured in the law that God is the cause of good things but not all things. And here we see it in this myth in this way. It is from God's act when he set the universe in its order that it has received all the virtues it possesses, while it is from his primal chaotic condition that all the wrongs and evils arise in it. And so that is the end of the myth. And what we want to carry with us into the second half of the dialogue is the question of how this myth is going to help Plato hone in his definition of the statesman as a kind of shepherd of mankind. So I do hope that you will join me next week as I go into that second half, and I do thank you for watching. If you like what you see, I do hope that you will like, and please subscribe. And also, if you have any questions or comments there, you can leave comments below for other viewers. And if you have any questions for me, you can send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as I can. So thank you very much for watching, and I do hope you will join me next week.